Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Rare Book Room. My name is Peter, and I helped write the events here at Strand. For a little bit of history, Strand was founded in 1927 by the Bass family over on what was then 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still run by the Bass family, and still housing new and used books. Tonight, I am thrilled to be welcoming Benjamin Moser to discuss Sontag, her life and work, his exhaustive new biography of the late literary titan. It follows Why This World, his biography of the influential Brazilian writer Clarice Lispector, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and brought him Brazil's first ever state prize for cultural diplomacy for bringing attention to Lispector's life and work. Benjamin has also written as the books columnist for Harper's Magazine and the New York Times Book Review and published several translations from French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch. Joining him to discuss Sontag is Bill Goldstein, founding editor of the New York Times Books website and an interviewer/reviewer for NBC's Weekend Today in New York. He is the author of The World Broken Two, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, and the Year That Changed Literature. He is currently a fellow at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, where he is at work on a biography of Larry Kramer to be published by Crown. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Benjamin, Bill, and Sontag to the Strand.
Well, thank you all for being here, and congratulations, Ben, on the publication day. So I thought we could begin. I'm sure nobody here needs to be told exactly who Susan Sontag was, but I thought we could start with putting into context how she became Susan Sontag a little briefly, and then also the cultural context in which someone like Susan Sontag could come to be. And I think that cultural context and her biographical journey to becoming Susan Sontag are linked in time, I mean, or of a time that perhaps doesn't exist anymore.
Well, it's interesting you ask how did she become Susan Sontag. I just have to say I'm very happy to have Susan's sister here, Judith, on the front row right here, which is a big honor for me to have you here, obviously. Susan and Judith both started their lives out as Susan and Judith Rosenblatt. And they didn't actually, and they were born both in New York City, in Manhattan, and then had a pretty peripatetic life as young girls, moving to Long Island, and then to Queens, and then to Florida, and then to Arizona, and then to California. Their father died when they were 5. Well, you were 2, maybe, when your father died in China. And so Susan, I think, was somebody who didn't have a fixed identity given to her by her family, because it was, the father disappears, and then there's a story that she tells that after their mother told them that their father was dead, she sent them out to play. It was like there wasn't time to digest this. And this is a girl who, like a lot of people who make up New York City, who make up big cities, came from somewhere else, and who had this dream of living in the capital and where everything's happening. And when Susan is 13, is that right? When Mildred, their mother, remarried a guy called Sontag. And she took the name, she said she thought Rosenblatt was ugly and foreign, which is interesting because it sounds really Jewish. Sontag's also Jewish, but it doesn't sound as foreign. And so she was someone who I think as a young girl was really desperate to fit in, because she didn't really know what to do with herself. And like most young people, or a lot of young people, especially creative young people, she was looking for something to model herself on. And it's fascinating, at the beginning of the book, I tell the story of their grandmother and their mother, the last picture of them, which is in the book. They were extras in a Hollywood film about the Armenian genocide in 1919. And in 1919, the Armenian genocide was still happening. And so one of the things that Susan modeled herself on, which I think people don't really appreciate, were the Hollywood divas. Because her mother and grandmother loved Hollywood, and her grandmother actually died in Hollywood when she was very young. And these were the women that she really admired. And I think it's funny now that you have so many role models for women intellectuals that you didn't have that. Susan there was one, and in Carolyn Heilbrun's fascinating book, Writing a Woman's Life, she says that for all this generations of brainy, booky girls, the one model you had was Marie Curie. And in fact, Susan, as a young girl, read Marie Curie's daughter's book about her mother, and she decided to become a biochemist and win the Nobel Prize when she was like 8, And so that's where she came from. And then she, of course, she grows up, she goes to school, and then she ends up in New York where she's able to find a literary and an intellectual community.
Well, I mean, just to say two things about the arc of the narrative of the book, which is so magnificent. I mean, what you've said just now reminds me of the last, or at the end of Susan Sontag's life. Friends are sending her the foreign films on DVD that they think she would want to watch, and she's actually watching Fred Astaire movies and enjoys that era of American movie at the very end of her life.
Yeah, it's funny. Judith and I were talking about that this morning. It's such a funny story because everybody thought, oh, she wants to see something horrible by Bergman, with like death and rotting corpses or something, and actually what she liked was Kiss Me, Kate, and the American musical that she grew up with, and that is such an important legacy, I think, for Americans and people all over the world who think of America and who look to America, because it's fun. And I think it's a side of Sontag that people don't necessarily appreciate, is how much she really appreciated that side of culture that wasn't necessarily the stuff that she became identified with, which was difficult, European, complicated. Of course she loved all that stuff, but she didn't think that was it, and that was the only thing she could do. And that's something that I think was really liberating. When you talk about in your previous question about what's the cultural context she comes into a context where high culture is in absolute death opposition to popular culture. And she becomes identified with a sensibility that says, well, you can like Dostoevsky, and that's fine, but you can also listen to the Supremes. And that's so obvious for most of us, that we can read books that are difficult and that are complicated, and we can study physics or whatever we want to say, and also maybe like trashy music. That, it doesn't feel to me like an opposition, but then it was really an opposition, because I think Americans have always felt that we are in a struggle to maintain the rare books room and everything that's in here, Susan Sontag, all that symbolizes, in a culture that likes trash and money and is always seeming to drag that culture down.
Well, and you paint a very good picture of the world, the cultural world into which Against Interpretation is published, and that she's suspected as a, quote, leveler. And you quote a wonderful Irving Howe remark about her. I think it's something like a cheerful eclecticism, in her views, and yet most people don't think of her as a leveler, at least 50 years after that book is published.
It is hilarious to read Against Interpretation and think that this is the sign of like the end of civilization. I mean, it's a difficult book. There's a few essays, notably Notes on Camp and Against Interpretation itself, that are fun, and they're kind of playful. But a lot of it is about French film. It's about all these things that you can't imagine. Sontag became nationally and internationally famous based on this book. You can't imagine that this book even would be published today. It's so difficult, some of it. And it's fascinating. One of the things I love about her life and writing about her life is seeing how many things that we think are obvious have changed in the 50 plus years. I mean, that's almost 60 years, right? Yeah, it's going to be almost 60 years old. How radical it was to write about gay culture, even in a veiled way. How radical it was for this really good-looking young woman to write about culture at all. I mean, even 2 years before, she's applying for a job at a magazine, and there's this letter that comes from a friend of hers that says, well, the fact that you're a woman is a problem, but I think they might take you anyway. And that wasn't like, wow, that's really sexist. That was just the way things were. That was a normal thing to say to a young woman who's applying for a job. So it's fascinating to trace feminism, this whole world of the great female intellectuals that I found so fascinating, because there was so much about it after I did my first book that I thought was not being said. Despite everything that is being said, there's still a lot more. We're still in an early phase of kind of understanding this. And how much there was to be excited by in that legacy, and how much there was to be shocked by.
Well, I mean, we've talked about how Susan Sontag became Susan Sontag, but you also talk a lot in the book how she became trapped in a certain way by that persona. I mean, almost that the persona of Susan Sontag became a fiction, and not so much the real life was happening elsewhere. I mean, they were all melded together. But can you talk about that image and how either she lived up to the image or became the image in many ways, like a Hollywood film star might have become?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important to understand about Sontag is that she comes from this lineage of Hollywood. She comes from this lineage of divas, and she writes about it. Once you start noticing the divas in her work, it starts off with Medea, and it goes to Joan of Arc, and it goes up through Lady Hamilton and the Volcano Lover, up through Sarah Bernhardt, Greta Garbo. These figures come back again and again, and you see that she's actually, in her life, she's deliberately modeling herself on them. These were the figures that she looked up to. And what happens to her is it's almost too successful, because when I was in Hawaii, Judith, actually, I don't want to embarrass you, but just seeing you is fun to be able to like tell these stories while you're here. But Judith said, oh, you need to talk to Paul Brown, who was the hairdresser, my mother's hairdresser in Honolulu. And I said, okay, hairdresser, I mean, people tell stuff to their hairdressers, like we know this about the world. But the story that Paul told me was about how after Susan had cancer in 1975, and she came to Hawaii to see her mother after she was recovered, and her hair hadn't gone, she hadn't lost her hair in the chemo, but it had gone white. And she was only 42 when she got cancer, which is the age I was until very recently, like three days ago. But
happy birthday.
Thank you. But it's shocking to think she almost died when she was basically my age. And she went to her mom's hairdresser, who was always trying to make her dress up and put on eyeliner and kind of act like a lady, which Susan was not really, that wasn't really her thing. But he put this white streak in her hair. Just, something that happened, it was probably like 2 seconds of thought, like, oh, why don't we do it this way? And she said, sure. And this hairstyle, not just the image itself, but actually the hairstyle became more famous in some ways than she was. And she would always joke when people said, what are you known for? She would say, the white streak in my black hair. And that's a joke, it's funny, but it's also tragic in a way that she becomes more known for her symbolism than for what she writes, for what she is. And I think, everyone is insecure and everyone is struggling behind the facade. I mean, even one of the things that's funny about being a biographer is you meet all these very famous people. And you realize after you've done this for a while that actually people are not that, you can be famous and be somebody that other people think of as a public property, but most people are actually pretty much the same. People are worried and they're working hard and they're trying to do it right and they're trying to get it right, and they do mind when you say horrible things about them. And, people forget this. And it's something that she found a sort of security in this image, I think. And what's funny is that the diva image, which is kind of a stereotype, it's kind of a reductive thing in a certain way, but it actually meant a lot to people. And I think in the way that the great Hollywood stars meant something to people, the way that Marie Curie meant something to her, she meant something to generations of women who wanted to write books, who wanted to put on plays, who wanted to be choreographers, and even I had a transcriber. One of the things I did for myself when I started this book, because I knew I would interview hundreds and hundreds of people, and for my last book, I did it all myself. And I thought, for this book, I am going to pay somebody. I don't care how much it costs. And I found this thing online that was pretty cheap, but of course it adds up to millions of dollars after 7 years. And this woman, I got a note from this woman in Ohio. I think it was Lima, Indiana, I think. Is that a place? Yeah, anyway. And she said, I'm just this woman in Lima, Ohio, and I get, or Indiana, and I get like, sorry,
somewhere.
If anyone from Indiana, and she was transcribing an interview I did, and she's like, I really, really identified with Susan Sontag because I love reading and I love books and I feel really in my town, I feel like people don't really care about that. And I was really excited to learn about her through this interview she transcribed. So I was really touched by that because I think that's what Sontag comes to symbolize to people. And even if the symbol isn't really her getting up and thinking, oh shit, what am I supposed to do today? Which we all...
Well, you talk about, though, in the symbol of Susan Sontag, I mean, that she was seen as a kind of truth teller, and yet she was, you say, in really, it's in the context of talking about her cancer, which at the end of her life seems to bring into very sharp relief a lot of the discontinuities in her personality, I guess. I mean, as any extreme event might, but that she could not conjugate that, her idea that to tell the truth always with the idea, I don't want to know.
Well, this is funny, and I think this comes from their mother as well. There's a line where she says, I think, Judith, you criticize her for being honest with your mother. And the mother says, that's exactly right. Just lie to me is what she says. Literally, lie to me. I don't want to know. And I think that's a very tough heritage to grow up with. And especially when what lying means starts to change, just like all these other categories, whether it's communism or America or lesbians or photography or, it all changes in her life. And so the idea of lying becomes something that she's very interested in. And she says, when do we actually tell the truth? And it becomes, I think for a novelist, for a writer, that is a real question, because you always know, like this book, with apologies to everyone, it's really long. It is so much shorter than it could have been. So I am constantly aware of what's not in it. I'm constantly aware of the cutting room floor. But that doesn't mean, but there is a truth in a narrative also. There is a truth in a myth. There's a truth in a metaphor. It's just not the same thing as the actual object. So like my book has Susan Sontag on the cover, but it's not the same thing as Susan Sontag. And you would be surprised how many people don't quite understand that distinction. I mean, this is a metaphor for a woman. It's not the actual woman.
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things now I'd read Susan Sontag's work on photography. What I came away from your book feeling, or in many places in your book, is that to a certain degree, I'm not sure if the focus on photography had made her lose sight of this, but the word is a mediation too. So it's as if she's struggling in her writing to achieve something that she recognizes is impossible in photography, but is also impossible in writing.
Writing is also a metaphor. I mean, language is a metaphor. Like water is not the same. The word W-A-T-E-R is not the same as the thing in this bottle. I mean, that is something that people have written about, philosophers have written about since Athens. And it's a fascinating subject in photography because the person in the photograph is not you. And that is very hard for some people to understand. I think like when people ask, like, what would Susan Sontag think about Instagram or something? You think, well, actually, she wrote about that. I mean, there's a lot of people now, you see this tyranny of the image. And I think you see it often in young women's lives who are terrorized by not living up to the magazine, not living up to the photo, not living up to the model. It's fascinating to think how many eating disorders and suicides and miseries have been launched by people trying to look like the photo. And nobody's actually sat down these people and said, that photo is not you. It has nothing to do with you. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, like, this is not Susan Sontag, but it also is Susan Sontag. I mean, there she is. That's her face. That's her standing there for the photograph. And so the ways that gets entangled is, I mean, that's, I think, for me, the real subject of the book is that yes and no. And Sontag's always fascinating. She says that the nature of thinking is but. So there's always a but. There's always, it's not or, it's and. And that's the theme that goes through her whole life, is that tension between the reality and the dream, between the photograph and the person. And it's striking how personal it becomes and how she does come to understand that it can kill people, literally kill people.
Well, I mean, you also say, I mean, right at the outset of your book, I thought it was just, an astonishing way and very moving and anxiety-provoking way to begin the book, because it sort of sets you to wonder how this woman settled this question in her mind, if she ever did. But one use of literature is to make us aware that other people different from us, really do exist. Other people, and then you say, other people really do exist. It is an astonishing conclusion to reach, an astonishing conclusion to need to reach. For Sontag, the thing outside of her own mind, not dressed in metaphor, was never quite acceptable.
Yeah. And this is something that happens when this little girl goes into her room with her book. And when, they move to Los Angeles, she finally says, I have a room, I have a door I can close. And she closes it and she locks herself in there with these books. And that's the safe world for her. And I think we all can understand that. I mean, probably if we're here tonight, it's because you're probably someone who at some point in your life liked to close the door and read your book or go to the theater or go to the movies and inhabit some other world than the actual crappy, disappointing, possibly abusive or violent world that you inhabit. And I think so that's very easy for me to understand. What's harder is to figure out a way to relate to the world after that, and how the literary person turns out to understand something happening in China. The little girl in Arizona can have this empathy for somebody. Like, was it The Good Earth? I can't remember one of the ones she read when, that was very moved by, or Victor Hugo. She can go to 19th century France in her mind. But it is harder in a certain way. Literary knowledge is not always something that can be translated into practical emotional knowledge. And that's something that I think she really wrestled with, because she was so, she was a person almost made up out of books.
Well, you say, or you quote Adrienne Rich on an essay of Susan Sontag's. I mean, and what it relates though to her larger body of work. I mean that her essays or her work would improve or really mean something when there was an emotional grounding to what she wrote, and you say that criticism really hit a nerve for Susan Sontag.
Yeah, because I think that Sontag was often trying to, one of the great things about writing this book, and I hope reading this book, is that seeing the less she talks about herself, the more she's actually talking about herself. And this is something really interesting, because she'll write an essay about a Bulgarian writer. And you realize, if you know what's going on behind there, this is all her. And in the way that we are always slightly talking about ourselves when we're talking about other people or our interests, she's trying to find a voice that can be an I voice. And when she goes to Vietnam, she says, she finally starts writing in the first person, and she says it feels like a sacrifice, because she was brought up by a mother who said, you say I too much. It's impolite. I can so totally hear this in like a Jewish grandmother of my, that generation saying, like, it's rude to talk about yourself. You're talking about yourself too much. You should talk about other people. You should ask about other people. Stop. Nobody cares about you. You're not so important. And Sontag believed that. But on the other hand, Rich, and this is the great feminist insight, I think, of the 70s particularly, that also becomes part of the gay criticism of the 80s, is that you actually have to say I. And that if you resort to metaphor and allegory, you distance your own body and your own story from the story you're trying to tell. It's fascinating to see that in that time, the 70s, the 60s, the personal essay, which we now think of, the memoir, as a pretty large branch of our current literature, was something that like Eleanor Roosevelt would write when she was 90. You know, it wasn't like somebody who had a bad experience in Ohio would write about. You know, it wasn't, it was something like maybe famous people could write about that, but like, then there's this whole genre of memoir and essay that's personal, and it's about I. And a lot of people like Sontag felt that that went really too far. But on the other hand, other people felt that Sontag was too impersonal. And I kind of like the impersonal, especially, as I say in the book, as I describe in the book, when you actually know what's behind it. And so she's not actually coming out and hitting you over the head with the emotional stuff, but it's there, like in On Photography or in Illness's Metaphor, she almost dies of cancer. Now, she doesn't say, there I was in, you know, getting my chemo, thinking about death. She doesn't need to say that. It's in there, you feel it, and it's fantastic to know, to have that extra layer. And I think that's one thing that biography can contribute.
Well, it's very interesting that you're drawn to the impersonal, and yet you wrote a very personal biography. I mean, I don't mean personal to you, but I mean, it goes into a lot of personal aspects, as any biography must. But I wondered what the challenge is of writing a biography of a person you mentioned, among other things, about her aspiring to the impersonal, that she liked to pretend my body isn't there. So, I mean, how do you write about a person in the world, in relationships? I mean, as a mother, as a daughter, as a lover, how do you make sense of that?
Well, it's fascinating that she always says these things. You know, you might suspect it, and then you go into the journals, you go into the diaries, and you do your interviews, and she's actually the one who says it first. So the thing about her body not being there, she writes about that constantly, about not feeling connected to her body and not knowing how to do all these things. Even like cleanliness, she wasn't good at. And she writes about this. She like actually reminds herself to shower, which is really fascinating because it's so weird. You think like, who needs to remind themselves to shower? Like, it actually does raise a question that you don't necessarily know the answer to. She's constantly worried about herself being bad in bed. She writes like page after page, and you think, oh my God, Susan, just relax. You know, it's gonna be okay. And she's always trying to come out of it. And what I think the question for the biographer isn't necessarily to give an answer to that, but it's to sort of see what she says about it, and then how that might reflect in her work or in her relationships. And that's actually fascinating.
Well, you talk, I mean, we talked about Adrienne Rich, I mean, and you talk about some of the questions of the 70s and 80s. There's a very interesting, I mean, you go into great and interesting detail about her ambivalence, I mean, to the idea of coming out. And I don't even mean coming out publicly, but and I mean, even sort of settling in her own mind individuals to whom she was attracted, as opposed to, you know, defining herself by her sexuality. Can you say something about her anxiety about the truth of that, whatever that truth meant in her mind? I mean, the scene, or it's not so much a scene as a whole passage where she's being profiled by Joan Alcala in The New Yorker, and the quotes, I mean, your interview of her is so amazing for the detail she gives of working on that profile, and the amount she says that Susan Sontag lied to her. I mean, lied to her in ways she said that, you know, were unnecessary.
Yeah, I mean, that really fascinates me. I mean, I can tell you the sort of intellectual background of that, which is that from right about the time that Illness as Metaphor comes out, it's about cancer, which is a disease of sexual shame, which I did not know. I hope some of you knew that. I didn't know it. I had never in my life heard that you got cancer because you were sexually repressed or because you didn't live a good life or you weren't fun. Really, I mean, these are things that I'm not making up. And that cancer was a punishment for a badly lived life. I had never heard that. What happens, Illness as Metaphor comes out in 1978. And in 1981, the first gay men start dying of this disease that nobody knows what it is. Turns out to be AIDS. 40 million people and counting have since died. And AIDS changes the way that people are supposed to speak about themselves. And there had been these critics. Rich, I mean, all the gay writers of the 60s and 70s, which were still very marginal. You know, I mean, it's very hard to imagine how marginal gay, not necessarily gay people, but actually speaking in the eye about gay life was. And this disease comes along almost as a sort of sales point for Illness as Metaphor. Like, it's like, oh, like, okay, this is what she's talking about, and we hope we don't have to kill 40 million people to make this point. But it's a shocking thing to read Illness as Metaphor knowing that this is exactly what's about to happen. And the fact is that Susan lied about her sexuality in ways that, for me as a biographer, really begged questions. I mean, Judith told me that, you know, she was dying before she acknowledged that, and that, you know, when they were in the hospital talking about apologizing for the wrongs they'd done each other. Susan was mad at Judith because she didn't become a lawyer. And Judith said, I'm hurt that you were never honest about your life. And that was something that you see time and time again, that for some reason she couldn't do it. And you know, as a gay person, I think I don't want to judge that because I don't have any illusions about how hard it is for a lot of people to be gay. I actually, you know, I didn't come from a family that was homophobic, or I don't come from a religion that hated gay people and sent me to Christian camp, you know, or whatever it's called, where they drive out the demons. But I do know what it's like to be 14 and be gay and be nervous about that and scared of it and not know how to talk about it and not know what it means and not know what my life is going to be because, you know, there weren't that many role models. And when I was a kid, everybody was dying of AIDS, you know, so it was scary. And I think that what's fascinating about Sontag in the historical sense is that you see that and then you see how quickly the social circumstances change. So like what we think of as now, if like someone's a lesbian, you're like, you're a lesbian, nobody cares. But that's not true that nobody cared. I mean, until the 1990s, it's important to remember that in this country, if you were a lesbian, your child could be taken away from you on grounds of homosexuality. That was not long ago. And you know, it actually happened to Sontag when she was divorcing Philip Reef, that her child was almost taken away from her because she was gay. And so I don't want to be the one judging that. I do want to be the one, through her, talking to younger people, who don't remember this. You know, I think a lot of young gay people, just like a lot of young women, don't remember Adrienne Rich in the 1970s. Or, you know, this is a history that I think we need to keep telling, and we need to keep remembering to honor the people who came before. And I think you can see with Sontag, as with every single thing, I hate to say this, but it is totally true, every single aspect of culture almost that you can think of politics, of sexuality, of psychology, of everything, it's all there in her life. You can, I mean, there's an index, it's like 18,000 pages long, I don't know. But like, just of all the subjects that come in this book, and it's an absolutely fascinating way to understand the century and to understand who we are and to understand just how not inevitable it is that we have these ideas.
Well, I wanted to ask you about her relationship with Annie Leibovitz, because one of the things that was so interesting to me that you point out, I mean, given what we've talked about with Susan Sontag and her, you know, the distinction between the image and the quote real person, you paint a very vivid picture of a couple that didn't always get along or didn't seem to be having a good time a lot of the time, and sort of didn't leave it to the imagination of their friends to sort of figure it out, but played it out a lot in public. But what I noticed about what you say about Annie Leibovitz is that in a certain way, it was either a wonderful match or a terrible match, because you write about her spending, her money. Her spending had always inspired awe, but her approach to money reflected a more general refusal of reality. And then you refer at another point to a state in their relationship. Cluelessness had its uses. I mean, which seems to me to apply to both of them. I mean, it was cluelessness about her finances, I think, that you were talking about. And it just seemed that they both were resistant to either the reality of how they really felt and what they really loved in each other, or to the reality of the pain that they were causing one another. I mean, it's never quite clear what those dynamics were.
It was clear to me, after hearing hundreds of stories about violent emotional abuse played out in full view of hundreds of people in New York, and you hear these stories and you think, oh my God, this is so horrible. How did they stand it? Why were they together? You know, even David, Susan's son, said, you should leave her. You're too mean to her. And for me as a biographer, it's fascinating also to think about how I would have written about this if it was a heterosexual relationship. You know, if this had been a man, if Susan had been a man treating a woman this way, it would have been a lot tougher to write about, I think, especially now. It would have been the thing that everybody would have remembered about the book.
Right.
Is, Norman Mailer beat up his wife. That would have been the story. And I didn't want that to be the story, but it was very hard to make sense of these two great divas, the two probably the most famous gay women in America, who were in this relationship for many years that everybody knew about. And that was an absolutely, people thought it was cool. Especially lesbians thought it was cool because it was so public and everything. And yet, one of the funny things, I was perplexed. And then, as I've said, I was called, I didn't have Annie's perspective on this. Annie had never spoken about this, ever, in public. And finally, I was walking down the street in Paris one sunny day, and I got a phone call from one of Annie's co-workers, associates, who said, she's finally decided to talk to you. And I was like, okay. I was really surprised because I kind of had found peace with, I was just not going to be able to speak to Annie because she just had a policy, private, public, she keeps them separate. And I said, okay, great, when? And she said, how about tomorrow? And I said, where? And she said, we're on 14th and 10th. And I was like, okay. And I just sort of paused and I said, okay, I'll be there. So I went to the airport. I had a lot of miles from this book, which was really, when you have to travel all around the world from Hawaii to Bosnia, from everywhere in between, you do have a lot of miles. So that's one thing. So I got on a plane and I went to New York and I had a day with Annie where I talked about this stuff. And the difference between the stories, so this is like the metaphor, the photograph, the difference between the stories about that relationship that everyone was delighting and telling all the time and Annie's perspective on it. It's like, I don't care what you think about my relationship with my partner. Like, if that's my business and his business, not your business. And when you feel it with Annie and you talk to her about it, it's totally different. She is a tough lady. She has been at the top of her profession for 50 years, ever since Jan Wenner sent her to photograph John Lennon because she could get a youth fare on like American Airlines. So she got like 25% off so she could fly to New York. She was...
I love how both the stories are linked by airplane trips. I mean,
yeah.
Her career and you're interviewing
Well,
her.
actually, it's appropriate because Sontag's life was so international. It was so on the road. But, you know, when you talk to Annie, you think, like, she's not this doormat, you know? And actually, as soon as I thought that, as soon as I realized that, I was like, of course she's not. Like, she knew exactly what she was doing. She could, what other people thought about this was what other people thought about this. And you really felt talking to her, she just loved Susan. She was happy. She gave her accountant was there and had all these papers. And I was like, no, it's okay. Like, I believe you. Like, he showed it to me. He's like, because there are rumors about that he had, that Susan had exploited Annie financially. He was like, that's ridiculous. And he showed me the papers showing how many millions of dollars she had given Susan. And Annie didn't mind. She said it was like taking care of a great monument. She's like, she was really happy to do what she could to take care of Susan. And so that's, for me, the final word on that.
Well, linked to that, and then we'll go to questions from the audience, is the idea that she was taking care of a monument, although she obviously loved her. I mean, I suppose I would prefer a monument who didn't call me stupid so often, but that seemed unfair. I mean, but I guess also she, as you say, was at the top of her profession for 50 years, and maybe it didn't bother her to be complained about that way. But the monument question, you quote Jamaica Kincaid as saying a certain thing about her son, David Reef, was very wounded by a certain treatment by his mother. But Jamaica Kincaid says, it's not ruthlessness, it's just Susanness. She was just a great person. But then she adds this fabulous line, I don't think I ever wanted to be a great person after I knew Susan. And so can you say something about
if you
just
know
how
Jamaica's accent, it's even better. She has this very rich West Indian, sort of British, Caribbean accent. I don't think I ever wanted to be a great person. But it's true that, like, I think the great person was that shadow self that even when she's 14 years old, she's already trying to keep up with this image of herself. She already feels that there's this person above her watching her and judging her and looking down on her. And that's the person I did not want to be, actually, is that shadow. I was always trying to understand it. And it, you know, she's a complex figure, and I always felt like anything that people saw, if you read the journals, if you get to know the people around her, you realize that she knew all this stuff about herself. And I think so many people know stuff. You know, it's like, if you have a drinking problem, people coming up to you and being like, you have a drinking problem, like, you know you have a drinking problem. But, like, it's not as easy in real life to improve yourself as it is for other people to have judgments about how you should do this and that. And I think that when you read about her life, you see someone who is always feeling she's falling short, but in that falling short, she's always that's a drive for her. And I think insecurity is a kind of gift. You know, it can destroy people, but insecurity can also be an inspiration. You know, it can be an idea like, okay, well, I'm just this girl from California, but I want to be Dostoevsky. You know, well, of course, you're not going to become Dostoevsky, but in that journey, which is, I think, the journey I tell about in the book, you can become Susan Sontag. And that's what I find really inspiring about her. It's not that you have to be perfect. It's not that you have to have no flaws, but it's what you do with what you have that is, well, I hope it's the story of this book.
Well, it's a very sympathetic portrait of a woman of great achievement who also had a great amount of pain and yet lived a very busy and productive life, either because of it or in spite of it.
Maybe because of it, you know, I mean, she, like Illness as Metaphor, comes out of almost dying of cancer. It's a great book. It's a book that inspired one of the great things in her archives, which is all the letters that people wrote to her saying, I thought my cancer was my fault. I thought I was condemned because I had lived a terrible, worthless life. And now I realize it's actually a chemical issue in my liver or wherever that I have nothing to do with. And so even the people who died could do so without feeling condemned. She has an incredible legacy, and I really just hope that this book can inspire all sorts of conversations about it and take her thought and her spirit, if I can say, forward into new people and new generations.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about is really her writing, so maybe some of the questions will be about that, because you do synthesize a great deal about her writing and put it into the life story. So that's something we didn't really cover here, but it's up
There's
to you
always
people.
more to say about her. It's crazy. It's been 7 years and I'm still like, I can still talk all night. So yeah, over to you.
To the audience.
If you want to raise your hand, I will bring you the mic. Bonus points for going first.
Don't be afraid of...
Hello. Thank you very much. I wrote these on my hand, so they're a little bit... I'm trying to synthesize them. But this is somewhat broad, but given your just capabilities as a biographer, in approaching two of the most impressive cultural figures of the past century, I was wondering... You must be much more familiar with the tradition of biography than I am. And I was wondering if you could perhaps speculate on what the future of biography will look like, and whether or not a biography has to account for itself as a genre. Because as I was listening to you, I was wondering, oh my God, if I was ever as famous as Susan Sontag, would I want someone to know about my sex life, for example? And so what are the ethics of this genre, and whether or not...
Oh my God. Okay, so everybody get a cup of coffee, make yourself comfortable. I'll try to answer that in like less than 3 days. I'll give you an example that for me is really important, which was that I had, because of my agreement with the estate, I was able to see her the secret part of her archives that'll be off limits for, in some cases, decades, including her computer. And her computer, she was older by the time email came along. I mean, she was in her 60s, I guess, when she started using email. So it's not like now where like my Gmail account has like 500,000 messages. I mean, it's basically everybody I've ever talked to in the last 25 years, every conversation, it's all there. It's really creepy to go through somebody's email, like somebody's computer. It feels weirder than going through letters for some reason, because I don't even really write letters anymore. I don't know if anybody does. You'd have to be sort of Victorian in your sensibilities to do it now. But we all have email, and what's on a computer is way more than anybody else had. I mean, like a writer that died in 1980, there's nothing on the computer. And that's not 100 years ago. That's, just a few years ago. And I think every day, for me, the ethics are, would you want somebody to write about your sex life? Well, it depends what your sex life is. You know what I mean? Maybe not, because it's not that important. But maybe your sexuality is important. It's not necessarily expressed in the way that Sontag would have expressed it or somebody else would have expressed it. What does your sex life illuminate something? I mean, often it does. I think we all know that sex is important, for example. We know that money is important. We know that your relationship with your mother is important. Your relationship with your partner, how you feel about your work, the bad reviews you got, all that kind of stuff. It matters to people, and as it happens, those are the things that are the most sensitive in everybody's life, and those are the things that everybody, or at least any writer has. And you're constantly sort of rifling through the panty drawer, It's kind of creepy, and you're constantly forced to ask yourself those questions. So how it's going to be in the future, I mean, I'm actually sort of pessimistic about it, but not because of the ethical stuff, but really it's a practical thing. Like, just taking the example of myself, like if someone had to go through my email, you would never get through it. I mean, there's thousands and thousands and thousands. Even I was actually classifying some of my emails because I'm trying to do this other email program. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But I was looking at emails from like 2011. Half of the people that I wrote to in 2000, I don't even know who they are. It was like something about like, I'll meet you at 7:30 or what. I mean, it's just crap. It's like everything that's ever come out of my mouth. And so if you think like, how would you go through that and try to figure out what's important in that? I think more than the ethical challenge, it would just be the practical challenge. I mean, I think that's what's going to save us all, is just hopelessness.
Wouldn't Sontag say that it would boil down to taste?
Well, that's what I've said. You know, taste is a great word because it drives people crazy. Like, oh, taste is just your opinion. And, you know, and this is something Sontag hated because she was very conservative in this idea that taste and critical authority comes from learning. It comes from study. It's not, everybody's opinion is not equivalent. You know, this was something, the person who spent their life studying Rembrandt is more capable of judging Rembrandt than somebody who knows nothing about it. And this is something that, you know, we've lost sight of because now if it's expensive, we think it must be good. And taste is a fascinating idea also because it remits to sensibility. Notes on Camp is about gay sensibility. And I was excited in the archive to find this document called Notes on Homosexuality, which is the first draft of it. So she changes homosexuality to camp. But we all know, like, you can usually tell if someone's gay, right? I mean, not 100% maybe, but I mean, I don't know. I feel like I'm pretty, I've got a pretty good record on that. You can tell, I mean,
Well,
you know.
at least by the morning, I mean, you might.
Yeah, no, but, well, yeah, but it's true. Like, you know, but how, if I can usually tell people are gay, but if they said why, then that's really hard. You say like, well, make me a list of like what makes that person seem gay. And then you get into stereotypes and bias and all these kind of things. And it's one of the things that Sontag's great at is making these lists of like nailing it down to these things. And taste is a similar, like I actually like with Clarice Lispector, my last biography, she was fascinating to feminist critics because she seemed to embody what was called feminine writing. She seemed to be obviously a woman on the page. And that's a really interesting question because like, what is a woman on the page? Well, actually, in a lot of cases, you can tell the difference between how a man writes and how a woman writes, but then define that. And so taste is one of those things that you kind of know it when you see it. But taste is different. You know, different people have different standards of what is tactful, what is tasteful, what is appropriate, what is polite. And I think as a biographer, you learn that you actually can't judge that for somebody else. I've now done this twice, and the things that people have gotten upset about in both of these books were things that did not occur to me would be controversial. And people get offended by stuff that doesn't even, you're always trying to be compassionate, and sometimes you don't realize what's gonna, like what for you is totally normal can upset somebody else.
Well, I mean, I think the ethics of it have to do with what the person saves. I mean, I don't think someone like, I mean, from what you've described and in the book and what you've said now, I mean, it's not as if someone like Susan Sontag keeps hundreds of thousands of pages of journals, preserves them, and doesn't think that something will happen with them. And I think it's very interesting in writing about people, as I've also done, I mean, is that it's not only what they save, but while you imagine the things that you know they destroyed, I mean, like T.S. Eliot destroyed many of the letters between him and his mother. He retrieved them from his brother. E.M. Forster consistently burned things, but it makes stand out then what they saved, because what they saved was not accidental. It didn't escape their eye. It was what they wanted to preserve. And sometimes there are very personal documents that are somewhat at odds with what we think of the propriety with which they presented themselves in their own time. So.
Yeah, and one other thing that's really interesting about the secret archives, I call them the secret archives. It's not like there's not like a big metal door that sort of creaks with cobwebs. You know, I sort of was optimistic on that account, but it turned out just to be a box of stuff. You know, is that actually a lot of the stuff in the quote secret archives, I couldn't figure out why it was in there, because I read it and I thought, oh, okay. I mean, you know, it's your phone bill or something. And some of it I figured out later what it would have referred to that would have been sensitive, but I didn't always. Mm-hmm. So it's just, you know, you do try to just practice empathy and not, you know, but also of course you're intrigued. It's like, what were those letters to his mother? Right. You know, of course that becomes something you are totally obsessed with as a biographer.
Yeah.
Hi. Sometimes I feel like every which way I look, the latest good essay collection by a woman, like she's being described as the Sontag of 2019 or the Sontag of our generation. And I'm wondering, I don't know, maybe either what you think Sontag herself would think of that, or if you think I often think, is that productive? Because as you just pointed out historically, is that achievable or accurate? And I don't know, I'm a current college student and there's still that cult of Sontag, like if we all could be the Sontag of 2019, but that's, I don't know. Yeah, I'm wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, I always think it's like, I don't like that, but it's not because I have some, like it offends me or I'm outraged or anything. I just think it's not true. And it's not that they could be better than Sontag or they could be worse, but like, I think it's a sort of cheesy label to put on somebody. It's like, oh, you're a girl essayist. Like, we're gonna call you Susan Sontag, even though you have absolutely nothing to do with her. I mean, it seems like there is a way, especially when you read a lot about women and women writers, which I've done for now almost 20 years, you see how like every female Brazilian writer gets called the Clarice Lispector of her generation, even though like it's somebody who has absolutely nothing to do with her, just nothing at all. And with Sontag, I feel like, oh, this is a woman who writes nonfiction. Like, we're not gonna sit here and think very hard. We're not even gonna probably read this woman's book. We're just gonna like stop there in our thought process and call her the new Susan Sontag. It just seems cheesy to me. It seems like, I don't know, like I see the like conference room with the water on the table and like 10 people thinking about like what to put on the flaps. And somebody says that and they're like, yeah, okay, like, we'll go with that. Sounds great. But it's not a work of criticism. Let's just put it that way.
Why Sontag? Did you have a whole list of women writers that you wanted to, or did your agent suggest this? How long did you go on this?
Yeah, no, it's so funny that that has come up so much this time about the women question, which is like, either they say like, oh, you write about women writers, and I'm like, well, I've written about 2 of them. They're like, so who's next? So it's like Eudora Welty or like, and I'm like, no, like the true story is I wrote about somebody I was in love with, still am, Clarice Lispector, and I had met her when I was in college. I met her in her books. And when I was studying Portuguese, and I just thought this was the greatest thing ever, and I wanted to do something to sort of put her out in the world. So that was like 20 years ago, and I'm still working. But and then I was asked actually to do Sontag by her estate, who had sort of thought about who should have the access that I was given to this material, and who thought that I could maybe do a good job. And so, yeah, but no, I think this is it. I think this is like for biographies really take so long, and it's like a marriage. You're with this person every single moment of your life. And with Clarice, that's been almost 20 years. I deal with her every day, and Sontag is the same. And I don't know. I would love to do something. I have no idea what it is, in case anyone's wondering. That would be a totally different way of writing. I have no idea what it would be. I'm like every day thinking about this.
You say that you are still in love with Clarice Lispector. Were you ever, or are you now in love with Susan Sontag?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, the funny thing about Susan, there's this quote that I really understood that someone told me. He said, like, I loved Susan, I just didn't always like her. And that's sort of, I think that's something you can really identify with with anybody close. Like, that's how I feel about my family. Like some of them are like easy to like, and to love, and they don't really cause you problems. But like a lot of like my relationships with people that I'm very close to, including my own mother, over the years it changes. Like you always love them. Sometimes they drive you crazy. Sometimes you're just like, did you have to say that? It's really annoying because you care about them You know, it's not like some random person. It's like somebody you actually are invested in and you like want. And so it's kind of fun. I've tried to not disguise that in my writing about them. I try to like make clear that I'm engaged with them and that I'm talking to them, because I am. I'm sitting in my room all day talking to these women. It's weird, but every day.
Thank you all for your questions. Bill, thank you for being
thank
here.
you,
And
Ben.
thank you for writing this book. If you do not have a copy of Sontag and you would like to pick one up and have it signed, we have plenty available in the back of the registers. If you do have a copy, we're going to line up on my right or left side of the room in front of the speaker. Ben is going to sit at this table and sign some books. Again, on behalf of the Strand, thank you all for your questions. Thank you for being here. Have a great night.